Two and two. There is a tradition in the British government that if you do things with the Parliament, you always start on time, even if nobody is there. I have been in meetings where 2 people were there and then gradually everybody kind of comes in, so we'll start. So we do that. Thank you for coming. Hope you're not too tired at this stage of the conference. My name is John Renfrew. I'm one of those people who live in that, I don't know how you view us anymore, that little weird cousin island off the coast of France somewhere. I'm a Claris partner and a community MVP. My history with FileMaker goes back to when I was working in the music industry. I was on a tour bus in Germany with Mary J. Blige, her first ever European tour, and the guy I was working for was using really old FileMaker, and he said, oh, have a look at this, and I was doing other database things at the time. That's where it all started. I moved from there into the conference industry. I ran a business making DIAs, 35mm slides for projection and doing projection. FileMaker created my model for how to price these things, and I was doing tech support, mostly for blue chip industries outside of London, because I live in the middle of the country. Utility companies, manufacturing, that kind of stuff. I ended up migrating into the car industry, working for about 10 or 12 years, 12, 13 years, with a major British luxury manufacturer of cars. Frankly, there is only one of them, and you can guess who that is. Producing presentation materials, doing AV support, both locally for in-house presentations, but managing presentations for 2 journalists all around the world. So that involved my in-house FileMaker skills. I had a drag and drop warehouse. I could put cases on a truck and produce a carnet for going to Switzerland, all that kind of stuff. Some naughty bankers ruined our economy. None of them have still gone to jail. That work dried up. So I moved to being a full-time FileMaker developer, and I've been a partner for about 15 years. Areas where I specialise are in returning student data to the government. That's all done in XML. And this year they just changed the schema. We've just been through lots of pain. And yesterday we all had a letter of apology for how much pain we've been through. Hasn't helped, but thank you very much anyway. I have a product which submits VAT. And my reputation was garnered by doing lots of clever things with PDF. Some of them Christians still can't even do, but that's my personal comment. And you are about the first people to know this. I will be speaking at Engage in Austin this year. So this session is not about how to use OData. If you want to look at that, look at the video from last year's presentation here, which is how to use it. But let's do a really quick recap for people who are not. First of all, hand up, who has played with OData? Okay, 30%. Who uses OData regularly? About half of that, okay? Really briefly, OData is something that has been added into the server product that gives us server-side rest on enabled files and servers. It runs in a separate process. You activate it in the admin console. There's a thing to turn on in the same way that you turn on WebDirect or you turn on the data API. And in a file, there is a tick box in the extended privileges for FM OData to give somebody permission specifically to talk to that. Okay. It is fully CRUD operational. You can do anything in a FileMaker file using OData. But the big thing for me is it uses basic authentication. So the big difference with the data API is you don't need to get a token, use the token, get rid of the token. It's a single call every time using basic auth. It can be transactional, which Fabrice hinted at. If there really is time at the end, I may just show you something. But that's not the purpose of this presentation. But you can also edit schema. So you can add tables, you can add fields, you can delete fields. You have to have full access privileges to be able to do that. I have built a table from a source XML file saying I need these fields, and then when the fields are there, imported the XML into it as a proof of concept. Absolutely works. Think of it as a cross between ODBC, without all of the nonsense with DSNs and drivers, and queries like SQL. It's a kind of combination of both. OData itself, in the same way that the XML gateway can run scripts in your files. You can send it some parameters, you get a result back which you write as a get script result. And any actions to do with anything to do with OData is in the OData log on the server. Next big feature, it's based on table occurrences, tables, not on layouts. You're essentially talking to the raw tables when you do this. There are some downsides, I think, to using the data API with the way that you have to have a layout because you can't control what you get back. Well, you're in control, but it may not be what you want. The data that is returned to you is metered. It comes from the same allowance that the data API uses, so that's 2 gig per user per year. I do know people who've broken it, but they're web developers who should know better because they queried OData every single time you refreshed a web page, and that ate the data allowance in 3 weeks. Not my project. But in general, you don't run into a problem with that. And I'm going to show you some techniques, or talk about some techniques which actually minimize the amount of data that's moving around, so that helps with your allowance. The query and what you want to be returned is part of the URL string. The only place where you have JSON in the body is when you're either creating or updating a record, because you have to have, here's all the fields and the values you want. Everything else is in the URL string. I'm not going to talk about how that works. Go and look at last year. Clay hinted yesterday, there are some things coming not that far away. OData 4.01. And here's a list of some amazing, I've tested a couple of those in ETS, some of them they haven't implemented. Please write to your favorite FileMaker engineer and encourage them to do it quickly, because some of them, like the in, is a really interesting and very powerful extension, and hopefully they'll support $compute as well. Not going to talk about that, that's just so you've got a hint on technically what really may be there. So the challenge is, how far can you push OData as a production idea? So one of the things is when we kind of look at new ideas, and I'll use selector connector as an example. I was there when Jason introduced it at Porson Error. Everyone went, wow, this is amazing. And then we've all seen some people who've implemented it really badly. It's not the tool that will solve every problem. In the right place, it works brilliantly. So here's an idea. It's not for every use case, but here's something that we're going to talk about today. How far can you push OData as a method of communication? So we have all been invited to look at what we'll politely call a legacy system. However you define that, by the way it was written, how many fields are in there, how many unstored calcs, what the relationship graphs looks like. It's had loads of people working on it. Basically, it's a mess. Wim had a little emoji for it yesterday, which I haven't put in here. And whatever analysis tool you use, it's going to look, you're going to go, oh my goodness, when you first look at it. It started as a decrepit building. Somebody added a whole load more things onto it along the way. But the reality is that either what the managing director thinks it is or would like it to be is a really plush, new, sleek building, and it's none of those things. I use FM Perception. There's a couple of numbers on there. No, just when I look at that, I can tell you where some of the problems are. Now, unfortunately, I was involved in this file 10 years ago. The person who was developing it didn't listen to most of what I told him, and then I've come back to it, and here is the result of what he's done. So the brief for this project was to look at a whole specific workflow which now had loads of holes in it, had performance issues. People were doing workarounds, cutting corners, doing this. People were getting stuck somewhere, had to close FileMaker to get back in, couldn't get out of the window. Just stuff that you don't really want. It's an area that is completely discrete. Effectively, it's a process, and at the end of the process, something gets handed off to somebody else. So it could be separated in process terms. There's also an opportunity with this, let's look again at this, to look at all of the business rules that were involved, adding things like better note-taking to records, and moving some processes to other APIs, like Teams, which they have as part of their Office 365 subscription. So it's a call center working in the insurance industry. They take leads from web adverts. They sell life insurance when you want to buy a mortgage, so your mortgage is covered. And therefore, there is a bunch of regulation in the context, mostly around how frequently you can call people, recording calls, or being able to answer complaints, all that kind of stuff. The IT context of the business is also relevant here. Everything about their business they run inside AWS space, and have done from the beginning. They were running a Windows server, occasionally spinning up a second server. They have other servers which they're running, one of them which runs the phone system and the call logging. They have an Azure thing. All clients are using workspaces as a Windows virtual machine in AWS workspaces. So they have 0 client machines, so they have a low IT cost. If the building burns down, they can take a computer into McDonald's and the business can carry on functioning as long as they have an internet connection and a headphone. So that does mean all of the traffic for their solution is inside the AWS network, never leaves the AWS network. Therefore, the internal traffic is fast. However, that does mask a few basic problems. Just because something appears to be fast doesn't mean it's doing the right thing. So when I log on remotely, I can tell you how slow it really is because I've got added latency, but the things that they're kind of masking, they're passing loads and loads of data, just happens quickly that they probably shouldn't be doing. And in the business, FileMaker, as we all love, is a key product. They have a site license, so apart from Microsoft tools, FileMaker is the tool for running the whole enterprise. So my strategy in the first meeting I had with them was, well, we're going to do a few things. We're going to update you to the latest version. We're going to move you from Windows to Linux because it's now stable enough. It's also easier to install and maintain from the developer's point of view. And there are frankly some cost savings to be had as well. With the move to ARM processors, you can now use the new Graviton instances, the T3G, for example, which is a further cost saving. There's a couple of caveats around the things you can't do. I'm still pushing Nick to get the base elements out for ARM. But in general, that's going to kind of tighten up the development. And we said, well, the next thing is we're going to do a proper test environment for what we're doing. Let's stop doing stuff on the live thing, because we all know it's not really what we should be doing, but we have to on occasions. Let's not admit it, but let's minimize live development. So the first decisions you have to come to when you're kind of approaching that as a project is what's actually underneath. It's not about necessarily, you've got to keep in mind where you're going, but what's underneath. And underneath most buildings are things which themselves are really incredible, but don't necessarily look pretty. So you have a lot of steel inside concrete to make sure it doesn't fall down. And when you've made the concrete, you still have to hold it up until it's set. So there's a lot of scaffolding that we have to consider. What are we going to put in place to make it work? So the way that we might have conventionally approached this project is somebody wants some new features inside this whole legacy box. So there you go, let's just start adding that. So if you have the chance to start again, we're not rewriting the whole legacy thing. We have a chance to actually address how we do the work that we do. And clearly one of the things is there's a big opportunity here to just isolate that piece of functionality from the legacy file. And we might have turned to data separation as a way of doing that. So we can have a brand new file, that's over there, this is an interface thing with all some new scripts. That's kind of lovely. I kind of went a bit further and went, yeah, but what if you separate out some of those features because they're in fact common areas that you might want to reuse later? Things like user management or logging, communication, external communications using email and SMS gateways, and the kind of shared service, like doing the same thing in teams in multiple places in the future, and introducing new ideas like message queues. So for things that don't have to be done right now, stick them in a queue. The queue will deal with it at some point in the near future, and if it can't do it, it'll keep on doing it. So if you introduce some kind of divide between this work and that work, the question is how big do you want that divide to be? So instead of just having a file with a bunch of features, well, let's take a few of those features out into their own files as well. Wim talked a bit about that as a way of distributed development so that you don't have everything in the one thing. It has some downsides or some extra things to consider. But I'll talk about a place where we mitigated some of that. And then for me, the big challenge was, in that gap between this piece of work on the left and this old thing on the right, can all of the communication be done between the two things using just and only OData? So not data separation. All the data is being passed backwards and forwards as JSON. And clearly the first question is, why would you want to do that? Well, for me, I could talk about all of the technical reasons, but the last reason is actually the most important. It was an experiment. I wanted to see if it would work. Because clearly you can roll back to data separation if it doesn't really work. But, you know, could I prove a point that this actually is mature enough to be able to be used? The things I love about OData, it's basic auth. You're not messing about with tokens. It works on tables, not layouts, as a reminder. And therefore, can we also get to a point where we're adding the absolute minimum to the legacy file to make this work? There might be some things we might have to add, but if they're the minimum, then that will be a bonus as looking at a way to the future. So we've got a massive divide. We do need to have a communication channel, but all of that channel, the question is, can I use OData? Maybe you're asking, are you mad? Or you've come to find out what I learned in the process, which is what this is about. There are some things to work out first. How fast would this be? So I've said from their perspective, well, it's going to be really fast because it's all in AWS. So you've got reduced latency issues. So that's something for you to consider if you thought about this as an approach. Compared to what we regard as native things like external file references. The issue is what we have begun to understand in the last few years and has been hinted at here a couple of times. When you look at a record, the question is what comes from the server to the client and how much is it not just this record, how much from inside this record and how many other records are coming at the same time. If it's coming in a batch of 25 in list view, that was why sometimes list view didn't work very well as it's full of unstored calcs. But we don't fully understand, because we're not really measuring it, how much data is going backwards and forwards. And when you modify one character in one field, there's a whole record being sent back across the wire. What this method might give us an opportunity is to control how much data is moving around. Compare it also to using SQL. So we have plugins that will enable us to write in SQL as well, directly into things. So we need to compare whether this is a good fit, whether it competes well with SQL. In the main, in this particular instance, I'm going to be creating records from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, and when that record is updated, I might want to pull some status back. So relatively simple stuff. I'm not moving documents around, for example, which has its own complexity. And comparing this to the data API. What are the pros and cons of the two different methods? data API, you have to create a layout on which this is based. You have to put fields on the layout that you want. If you either create loads of layouts that are skinny with only 5 fields on them, or you create a layout that's got 40 fields on, but then every time you query that record, you get all that data back. We're trying to not do that, basically. Which leads to, Hamza's favourite topic. Well, let's measure things about speed that we can at least measure as part of what we're doing. And how much is too much? Are there some technical limits of, if everything's in a URL parameter and it suddenly turns into something really long, what are the technical limits of that? So we kind of understand that on Windows it might be 10,000 characters. Am I ever going to get there? But it's a thing to consider. Documents aren't being moved. It's a positive. You can only use OData to move images and PDF files. You can't move binary files with it. So if you were doing this kind of project and you wanted to move other files around, then you would be using the data API for that part. So it'd be a hybrid. What about FileMaker's performance? You're going to be passing JSON backwards and forwards. It might not be a lot, but you're going to be doing this looping thing where you're getting a set of keys, going through setting some fields. How performant is that really? Are there smarter ways in which we can do that? Does it stand up to... Everybody knows how to build a file with 5 records that is beautiful and fast. The issue is, how does it work in production? And using OData in this way, what's the resource implication of that? So I've indicated that the OData engine is a separate process on the server, so it's not stealing from some of your other processes. It's within the bounds of what the server capabilities are. That's not true when it's running a script. A script is just like another PSOS session. It has to start a session up because a script has to be layout context driven. So running a script too often by too many people is like setting up 40 PSOS sessions, and we all know you probably ought not to do that unless you're measuring things and you're happy. But then obviously with this client, the chance to move to card window a lot to be able to control workflow, so you can control exactly where somebody is. But there's a technical thing which I have just recently solved for a different thing. When you've got a card window open and you want the card window as a selector, how do you put the card window on top of the card window? And technically you can't. If you have been in any of my sessions in the last 5 years, the answer is you put a document window on top of the card window and then put a card window on top of that. But when you put the card window on the top and you say dim the background, it doesn't work because it's on the window underneath, not the root window. Okay? A couple of little things to bear in mind. And what are the dev practices that need to change as a result of doing that? What are the things that I have learned and that we might need to be better at as developers? First thing was just creating, I don't know if this is your practice, just creating loads of little proof of concept files for each little bit. Not trying to build the functionality into the file that you're going to use. So I had a file where I tested all of the Teams integration stuff I was doing, and where I tested an SMS gateway, and where I tested what I wanted to do for logging, and where I tested some OData queries. I had the ability to do that in the context of how big the project was going to be, to take weeks and weeks to potentially do that. But what that means is then you have code that you've tested that you can start to copy and paste into other places. It means you can make sure it works. There are things like, well, okay, when you're doing that now, how and what do you error trap? So for example, I will show, there's a technique where you can say, do this query, but don't send me any data back. In FileMaker, you get a 10 error, you get a 204 HTTP thing that says no content. It's not actually an error because that's what you asked it to do. But therefore, you can't capture that with getLastError in the same way that you might for other types of errors. Or you have, if your code says if not getLastError and the error is 10, 10 is an allowable error, and that will something you need to change there. And obviously, part of the goal is, I was a big fan, and I've always been a big fan of modular programming. Once you've solved a problem, then you shouldn't be having to solve it on multiple days. So being able to repeat all of that same code. So I have a snippet script now, which is growing almost exponentially, but it's things that I've solved. That's the code I want to use because I know it works. And alongside that, I have a custom function file in which all the golden master versions of my custom functions work, and they all contain a version number inside them. So I can compare that with the version that's in a file. If I find a problem in a custom function, I go into that file, I test it. When I've changed it, I change the version number, and then I can go, okay, now I can copy this code from there to there. I use FM comparison and FM perception heavily to be able to kind of work out what's going between files to pick out the version number. Can talk to you about that separately. So the kind of the tick things, what is a good thing about this approach? Well, it does meet the goals of modular programming. So you've got some ways to do things which are repeatable. If you can pick up a piece of code and paste it somewhere else and it's independent and then it just works, or you just change a single parameter, there you go, thank you very much. And the big thing is the change in terms of from the outside, particularly one of the managing directors who has some interesting demands. He's previously turned up to a FileMaker developer and said, can you do this? And they've gone off and done it. And I've said, no, if you want that, I'll put that into a separate file for you. He has some very specific requirements about what he wants to see about change control. Who changed that phone number on what day? But that's his bag. He now has a separate file where all of those data changes are logged because he's the only person who's really interested in it. And it means you don't have to build that into the main file. And like I said, intelligently using card windows to control the flow has helped them understand how to write a flow. So in doing this, first of all, this is easy because there are a load of similar things. The first question to answer when you're doing it in an environment where you're working on a development server, a test server, a live server is, this code I'm writing, which server does it need to run on? So I've adopted the Postman handlebar notation for things which will be replaced at some point later by something. So the domain name, the server name might change. I need to find a way to quickly find out which server I want to run this on. And can I run it from my dev server on the test server just by changing a parameter to be able to pick up the different domain so that I can just test that that works with some like data as opposed to my fake data. Obviously, the authentication needs to be obscure, but we all believe that to be true anyway. But the one thing is that the OData account needs to have the same authentication string in every single file to make this work. So that's one of the downsides. If you believe it's compromised, you have to go and change it in multiple places. Small risk, but still something to consider. But you have a privilege set that only does OData. And you can have a privilege set that only does OData, but does not allow for deletes, for example. So you are as much in control of what you can do with this as you are with any other regular user account. So just because somebody could write maliciously an OData script, an OData command to do something, if the account doesn't have the permission to do it, it won't destroy your data. So you are in control of how this works. All you need in the URL is the file, where the file is, fully qualified domain name, and the table on which you want to operate. You're in control of those things, not difficult. So creating a record needs a JSON object of the fields you're creating. Updating a record needs the same JSON object, but it also needs a filter. We'll talk about that in a second. Which record do I want to apply this data to? If you're deleting or getting a record, all you need is the filter part of it. So instantly you're building blocks of a script which have a set of lines. Which set of lines do I need under which circumstances? Means it's easy to copy and paste some of that stuff. If you're running a script, you can pass that script any payload you like. So you can pass a whole load of JSON to a script. The script will run whatever you want it to run. And then at the very end of that, you define what the result's coming back with. So an example of what we do is I have a new record of a customer. I create that record in table 1. I create a second record in table 2 with some of that data and the rest of it is looked up. I create a third record in table 3 that uses lookups. But now I have 3 UIDs that I've created that are linked to 3 tables. So I concatenate them into a JSON object, pass them back. So first of all, I know it's worked. And I now know if I ever need to modify one of those records in the other file, what is the unique ID of the record in which of the tables, as a for example. You're in control of that. So don't just think of it as a yes/no answer. Did it work? Send some rich JSON back as the answer to a script. So what about scripts? Yes, they need a context in which to run. So it's spinning up a process on the server like another user for this to work. That uses resources. So if it's going to happen a lot, potentially managing that with a little bit of a queue, does that mean that you've got an issue because what you really want is for it to happen now? In reality, in this legacy file, I created a single script that did all the jobs that I might want it to do and passed it a variety of parameters to do that. So I knew that that was happening. I was also aware of how often this might happen and was happy that that was within the bounds of what would be acceptable performance. That's something for you to consider. Here's a question which, if you don't know the answer, go away and find out. When you run a script using OData, does the on first window open script run or not?
Tell us.
No, go and find out for yourself. I do know the answer, and you could ask me later, but that's a whole, there's a whole scenario there. The script that you run can itself then run other scripts. So I have created what I've called a machine file where I pass a big packet of JSON saying, now, could you please go and run this script in this file and do this? Oh, and then when you've done that and that's successful, could you also go and do this? So send a message using SMS, using the messages bit of the thing. When it comes back and it's been successful, go to the logging file and say whether it's successful or not. And if it wasn't, put a flag on it so you could repeat it. And then do something else in another file and then concatenate all of the JSON that's been returned from each of those files into, yes, that was successful, that was. There was no errors along the way. So you're not limited to what that can do. One of the advantages of that approach, so particularly when we came to doing Teams stuff, I do 2 specific tasks in Teams. One is setting up a user. So they already have AD. I send the email address, I get back a UUID for the user. So that I can create a one-to-one chat between, I can send a personal message to that person's Teams. And then the second thing is actually sending that message. They're both Teams actions. Those are both done through a third-party file. So the advantage of that is the only person who knows what the Teams authentication is are the developers and the managing directors. Nobody else has privileges to get in there because nobody should be getting in there. And therefore, it shouldn't be able to be hijacked in any kind of way. So it moves security into a very small box, and you don't have to deal with the functionality being spread across your whole file. I mentioned in Fabrice's session, we now have some new error functions. What about using those as we're going through? So on the right-hand side, this is how I've approached it. That's just my approach. If you get last error, you can now also do get last error location and get last error detail. But you have to get all 3 of those at the same time. The action of doing get last error turns the last error into 0 because it was successful, and therefore the location and the detail are no longer there. So you have to grab them together in one batch. So I've then created, excuse me, a JSON object. That's my choice, just showing you because that's where I ended up. I now have a rich error object. So the very simple version is there an error, true or false? But then I have additional things about the error if I wish to then use that for logging. I've got some advanced stuff. So an example of that would be on the left. So creating records. When you create a record, is there any use for a select? Does it bring anything back? Does a select work when you create a record? Do we need to? That's some more homework. However, my favourite child, I have several grandchildren now as well, but I have a favourite child, and it's this header line. Return, prefer equals minimal. That says, don't give me any data back. If you create a record, without that, it will give you back the records you've just created, including all the auto-enter fields that are on the table. Well, I just told you what I wanted you to create. I already know that information. What I really just need to know is, did it work or not? I don't need the data to come back to me, unless I need to use that data. So what if you get nothing back, but I want to be able to use something from the record that I just created? In the header, and the next slide is an example of a header, there is a line in the header that you can use a custom function or a while function to extract, starting with the word location, because what you get back is the row ID of the record you just created. What I then do is use that information to make a second call, which just says, the record with this row ID, can I just have the unique ID back, please? So I minimize the amount of data I'm passing. It's a second call, but it's still only 2, and your data API would be a minimum of 3. Show you the header in a second. So I happen to have a field in all of my tables called grid, which is an auto-enter calc of get record ID. That is the row ID. Is that Klaus at the back? Go on. When you create a new one, if you do return as minimal, you get nothing back. You get back the whole record that was created, including UUID, auto-enter, timestamps, everything. Yes, so that's why my question is, can you do a select? And a select says, just give me back this. That's for some homework. Go and try whether that actually works or not to minimize that data. Again, I might know the answer. At all points, test every OData call you do with some sample data, because the biggest thing you run into is 8506 error, which says field type mismatch. Trying to put a number into a text field, getting a date wrong. A date is a string in ISO format that you send. It's not a date format, it's a string that FileMaker then interprets as a date in your locale. Test things. What happens if these fields have no data in? Is it going to screw it up? That's the biggest cause of frustration, is sending something in the wrong format. That's just a hint. So this would be the header you get back from a create. And the line you're looking for is a line that starts with location. There's the server, there's the file, there's the row ID of the record. So if you go to get record ID of that record, it will be 79. That's FileMaker's internal record ID, but they give it you back. So I can use that in a query to say what's the UI, what's the unique ID, what's some of the value from that record, 1 field, 2 field, 3 fields. So as well as knowing it worked, I've also got the unique ID. When you do an update, it's a patch command, but you need to additionally say which record or records is this data applying to. Again, if you do a patch and you do a select, well, what happens? That's the same part of the homework for you to do. Using the same header, return minimal, you get a different line in the header which you need to now extract, but it helpfully contains something called a value called FM affected rows. So here's an example header of a patch. In this particular case, I did for this test, I updated 40 rows. So if you're patching a single record, you'll get back FM affected rows 1. That means it was successful. If it was not successful, you'll get an HTTP error. So you don't get back FM affected row 0. What you'll get back is a 400 error or a FileMaker error, 8506 error going, no, you've made a mistake, or 301 because the record's locked. So therefore, you already know that it didn't work. You see what I mean? So this is just a confirmation that what I just patched did work. Hasn't sent me any data back. So if I've patched 40 records, I don't want a JSON object with the full 40 records back, thank you very much, because I don't need them. I just need to know, did it work? Obviously a get, grab me some information. We have a filter. What record are we looking for? And then we do want to select. So this is in SQL terms, talk about that in a second. So when I'm getting things back, I don't know how many of you on the tables that you're going to be working with in this way have a single field which is a pre-composed JSON object of the fields that you want. So that you say, could you just give me that field back? It's already in JSON format, and therefore you know what it's going to be. And also you can do things like what I want to call it, which might not be the actual field name. Found that a very useful tip, particularly when I've got a quick example of where I'm querying a user's record. I want a block of JSON about that user, which includes things like permissions and various things like that. Another question, what happens if when you return JSON inside JSON? What does the FileMaker calculation engine do with that? The opposite way is, if I want to send JSON to my man-in-the-middle file, which is going to be used by multiple, so this is a thing I'm passing on to another file, what happens there? There is an occasion when what you need to do is do a JSON get element, but then you need to format the elements, and then you need to do another JSON get element off that, because it actually treats it as a string, not an actual JSON object. That's to do with how FileMaker, Claris behind the scenes, is processing JSON, it's doing text parsing on it. It's making up whether it thinks it can be a JSON object. If it can't, it'll just treat it as a string, and at that point, JSON get element will fail, because JSON element doesn't work on a string. It has to pretend it's a JSON object. Just a comment about making things lean. You know, the idea of this is not to make things more complex or add stuff up. So you want to bring back the minimum you want, but then you are looking for something inside that JSON that you've been returned to then do something with. There's no point passing information just for the sake of information. It's not a dashboard system. It's I did something, now I want to do something with the data I created or updated. A really cool thing about how OData works that we've used here is a cross join. It's the equivalent to a SQL inner join. When you create the filter, it creates a join on the fly, okay? Then the result that you get back, you have to use an expand command on. Within the URL, it uses the table / field as the notation. So there's an example SQL string for doing an inner join. Select a.this, b.this from here, where I've joined this to this on this equals this. Okay, so that's a SQL thing. A cross join would be saying, okay, in this file, I want to do a cross join. The first thing is my filter is make the join first. Join this table to this table on this equals this, and or some other criteria. So that, and or, yeah. I think you find it will work. After that, you then have, it's not just a simple select, because you have to expand it across all the tables that you've just joined. So now we have an expand. So I want from this first table, then I have a select, what do I want from this table? And then what do I want from the other table as well? So instead of you having to create, so here's the thing, if you have a legacy system, do you really want to go in and start creating more relationships just so you can make your little thing work when you can build it on the fly as a query? My answer, no thank you. Oh, there clearly are issues with any FileMaker thing that we do. All of the things work apart from when they don't. And there are 5 other ways to make it work possibly. Beware of things where you're using what we are now calling fields with global storage, particularly as it relates to scripts, because when you run a script via OData in another file, that other user that is happening in the same way that we understand with PSOS, that has no understanding of my set of globals. I did get recently caught out with this, where I was updating some records which were pre-composing some XML, but it was based on a global field, depending on which country you were on, and I wondered why the result I was getting when I ran it this way wasn't the same as the result I got locally. And Carl, who's at the back of the room, reminded me that you just have to take the file down locally and make the globals work there. Just be aware that globals are a bit of an issue there. Field names. Please don't start field names with an underscore, even though when you import an Excel file into FileMaker, it will put underscores under the field names for you automatically, or it did for me last week, lots of places. Just don't do it. The reason is you start having to escape those in the OData query. So why do you want to do extra things? Just take the underscore off the front. It's fine in the middle of the field name. Just don't start a field name with an underscore. Just don't do it anywhere, really. So underscore created time is fine, because you don't really care about ever moving that round. Anything that you want to move round, don't start with an underscore. Yeah, please don't. Go and get somebody to pay you to do that. Second thing, if your development style has script name, space, brackets, parameter 1, colon, parameter 2, colon, space, close brackets, it will not work in OData at all. You can't even escape it or URL encode it. It just does not work. Please remove that from scripts that you want to run in OData, and then you'll find they're fine. I'm just saving you a little bit of pain. Or go and try it and then say, oh yes, John, you were right. Okay.
Can you use square brackets?
I don't know the answer to that question, because once I've got rid of the brackets, I'm not doing anything at all. I don't know. Go and find out. Post a post on the community. Yes.
A quick walk around like this.
That's one way of doing it. That's a different kind of workaround. The question is, what are better developer practices? Well, maybe a script name underscore parameter underscore parameter underscore parameter would work. Well, it will, but brackets just do not work, and you can't get around it. Just don't. And reserved words. Don't call fields by reserved words. Particularly, don't call the field ID. The reason is, and I did answer a query on this recently from somebody, if you say in an OData query, this blah, blah, blah ID, it's going to use the internal ID, not before it uses your field name of ID. So you're not necessarily going to get the results that you want. And particularly in 4.01, where we can refer to things in a better way, that'll help us with some development practice. But again, I'm saving you some time by saying just don't do it. So what may be the bonus of this kind of approach? If OData is everything we're doing, well, it's really fast as a thing. It's not slow, is my point. So in the same way that a SQL insert that you're doing through a plugin, it's not really slow. It's really quite fast. So that does help with record locking. Now, in this particular case, I'm creating a record in a table that nobody's going to be on yet anyway because they don't even know exists. So record locking's not being an issue. But in other places where I want to query something like in a users table, the OData action is so fast that the record is updated and closed almost instantly. So it reduces the chance of record locking. And obviously any errors, so if somebody else is in the record, you will get back a 301 error saying somebody else is editing this. So you get back FileMaker style error codes. Like I said, the aim of kind of that approach was, can we do it with the minimum amount of work in a legacy system? All I really had to do was in a couple of old tables add a unique ID to every record so that was common across what I was doing. I added a single script that I did have to modify a few times, but that script would then dispatch and go off and do a few things. And rather than update, so file over here that somebody else is now working in, rather than every time they update a record, push the data back, to save, when I'm in this file and I need to know what the status now is, I just do a quick get. At the point where I say, find this record, part of the find then says, oh, what's its current status, and update it. So I'm only updating the data as I need it, not all the time, because it doesn't need to be a live system. So a clear example of a place where this really helped. So we have a users file in which the HR department and team leaders, the HR department manage users, adding new users, and saying what you can do. And in there is a field with a star rating, 1 to 5. But we need a way for a team leader to modify the status of their user on the fly. So instead of having to have that person have access to the users file, we do an OData query. I get back the status of this person. I display it in a virtual way. Here's a star rating. You modify the rating. Then you click Save. If the rating has changed, I then quickly push the data back because I'm only pushing back one field of data. So really, really quick. It means those people can do that task without having access to the users file. So the only people who have access to the users file are developers and HR and the managing director. So again, you've reduced part of your security surface. I did nick the star thing from one more thing for Brice, by the way. So I did it, and it works, and it's now in production. But the big question is, yeah, not just did it work, but I'm now carrying loads of technical debt. Was it actually worth it as a project? The reason I'm doing a presentation is because I think the answer is absolutely yes. It's enough of a big leap of a change of approach to consider doing. What did I learn? I learned to be a better developer because I had to approach a few problems that I wanted to then solve once and never again. So it did change how I'm now doing error logging. I think that will hook into the new on-record transaction stuff and the on-window transaction stuff. So the object I've created, I won't have to recreate. I can now potentially use it again. Would I do it again? I have done already. I've been using OData in other creative ways. Importantly, what about the customer? A couple of weeks after it went live, so he didn't love it because I made him do proper testing, and that took him 3.5 months, 3 months. He'd never done real testing before. He'd gone, does it work? Oh yeah, that's all right. And then 3 days later, oh, it's broken, can you fix it? So we made him do proper testing. So he didn't love that experience. And in fact, he's now employed a project manager to manage the projects as opposed to him. But he phoned me up about 3 days after it had gone live and said, I actually really appreciate, we had to go, I would happen to be off and away. We had to change something about a user really quickly. And actually, I now realise why you did all of that other work and how quick and easy it was to do that thing in there. Because he has access to things he needs access to, and everybody else has access to things they need access to. So I do have a very happy customer. We're in the middle of doing the next part of a project where we're doing something not totally similar, but we're using data separation for that. But do I think it was worth it? Absolutely. Just this week, I have a student record system which I operate. We had a government deadline last Friday before I came here. In the week before, I was mad busy adding information to it. And we discovered that with one of my clients, who are a big French business school who have a branch in London, and we had to add to the students' records something called off-venue activity, when you're not studying in this venue but doing something somewhere else. And that includes studying in Paris or Turin or Madrid or wherever. That's now classed as off-venue activity. So I have a record for the student, 800 students that I had to do this for. They have either they're studying in London, or they're actually taking time off, or they're studying in one or other European locations. And on that basis, I had to create 0, none, or 1 child records of the record I was on. I had to, in another child part of the record, set the load to 0, 50, or 100%, depending on how much they were studying. Somewhere else in another field, I had to say, if you were always in London, this field is empty, otherwise it's 0, 1, which means studying abroad for part of the time, or 0, 2 for studying abroad for all of the time. And then over here in the location child set, similarly, 0, 50, or 100. Now, that would be a file and multiple imports with a chance to get those kind of wrong and no chance to back up. Because it's like a mini vertical, I didn't want to write a script. Nobody else needs this functionality. You write the script in the file, then you update the file, and then you've lost all the work unless you kept a copy. So I had a raw data file. I just wrote a script in OData to do some queries and to do some patches and or to do some creates. Once I'd fixed it for one student, took me a few hours to be fair. Doing it for 800 was then really simple because I just went, right, I know the model works. There you go, thank you very much. So being able to modify from the outside data that your client really needs to be modified in a way which is a complex thing. So the reason is because I don't have the student ID on every child's table, because that's like a waste and it's not normalized. So it's about how you work out what the parent and what the child is. So really a quick example of something else I've done that I think was a complex task. OData absolutely up to the mark to be able to do it. Don't have time, but I will just comment. So Fabrice mentioned at the end of his session that transactions using a batch, FileMaker OData using a batch can be transactional. That is true. A batch is where you bundle multiple things together. If one part of it fails, the whole thing is not applied. I believe it's true, because I have had it working, that you can, using an OData batch, create the same record in 2 separate files on 2 separate servers, as long as the authentication is correct. At some point, I will post about that once I've gone back to the demo and proved it worked, but we don't have time to look at that now. I do have a couple of moments for questions, or you can chatter to me to your heart's content. Yes? You will get back an error as part of that. Can't answer that question off the top of my head. I'd need to go and just try it and look at it. You'll get back a FileMaker error saying something was locked. You might get back 39 have been affected. That's used in a special case where I want to, in fact with this XML, I want to kick a load of records at the same time. Just update a field that I know isn't locked. I wouldn't usually be patching 40 records in one go. I'd do it as a batch. Fabrice. So I can answer for Clay because I do know the answer, because I might have spoken to Clay about it on a forum. The issue is it's a server-side process. So it's running in a process on the server. Execute Data API is running in the client. Am I correct? Well, kind of, but the big difference is that you can trigger the data. You can't trigger OData in the client because it's a server process. Yeah, quickly, please. Any other questions? Yeah. So again? I think it's so it depends on the query you're doing. I think it's absolutely comparable to ODBC and SQL queries under certain circumstances. SQL queries in FileMaker in certain circumstances are in fact fast, but we all know where they're not fast because it's an interpretation layer. ODBC, it's a similar thing. You have to go out through a DSN to get the access to it and get the thing back. Absolutely comparable. I would have said slightly faster than ODBC because you're not going through another loop to get there. So you're not going through the DSN to make the connection to do the thing. You just go straight to the server. Go, thank you very much. So some advantages. You can be having OData. You don't have to. I'm doing it across two files that are known on the same server. You can have one of these functional files on a completely different server somewhere else for resilience. You now have distributed all of your potential development into where's the best place for this to run from, and that may be to do with latency, it may be to do with resilience, it may be to do with I want to keep that code away from everybody else so they don't know how it works, which I have in one case. Anybody else? So technically, the answer to that is yes. And the reason why you might want to do, it's not as simple as you might think. I will write up something about that for people who are here. If you do a get, yes, can you use a post to return a result as opposed to using a get? The reason why you might want to do that is that what you have asked for in the get is logged in the OData log. So if somebody has access to the OData log, they can see what you were looking for. So if somebody breaks into your admin console and downloads the OData log, they can infer things about your data from that. If you do a post, so when you create a record, the JSON that you send in the post is not logged in the OData log. Just the post request is. There is a way to do it. It's a hack and a workaround. But the only reason you do it is you really didn't want your stuff to be logged. That's up to you to decide. I'll write up something about it and make sure this group have access to it. Anybody else? Sorry, it was a rush. I hope you found it really helpful. I've given you some homework. If you really want to know just like basics about OData, look at my presentation from last year, add it to this. This is where I've got to it. Hopefully, in a couple of years' time, I'll come back and we'll be doing some amazing things with it when Clay's given us 4.01. Thank you. Klaus. A sticker from Data Manix.